I never thought a single moment could unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. But that's exactly what happened the night Rachel taught me how to kiss. We were 23, both fresh out of college, both supposedly grown women who had figured out who we were, and yet there I was, sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor with a bottle of wine between us, about to discover that I hadn't figured out anything at all. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with that kiss. It starts years before, with a friendship that everyone said was too close, too intense, too something they couldn't quite name. Rachel and I met freshman year of college in the most unremarkable way possible, assigned roommates in a dorm that smelled like cleaning products and teenage anxiety. She walked in with her parents trailing behind her, carrying boxes of carefully labeled belongings, and I remember thinking she looked like someone who had her life together, in a way I definitely didn't. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore this simple white t-shirt and jeans that somehow looked elegant on her, and when she smiled at me for the first time, I felt something shift in my chest that I immediately pushed away and labeled as just wanting to be her friend. We became inseparable almost immediately. People used to joke that we were joined at the hip, that you couldn't find one of us without the other, and I loved it. I loved having someone who understood me without explanation, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who knew exactly what I needed before I even asked. We studied together, ate together, stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about everything and nothing. When I got my heart broken by some guy who wasn't worth my time, Rachel held me while I cried and brought me ice cream and told me I deserved so much better. When she was stressed about exams, I'd make her tea and quiz her on flashcards and remind her to breathe. We were best friends in the purest, most consuming way, and I never questioned it because, isn't that what best friends do? Isn't that what female friendship looks like? Except there were these moments, these small flickers of something I couldn't quite name. The way my stomach would flip when she'd brush her hand against mine, the way I'd find excuses to touch her, to adjust her necklace, or fix her hair, or grab her arm when I was excited about something. The way I felt almost jealous when she'd talk about guys she was interested in, this weird possessive feeling that I'd tell myself was just me being protective. The way I'd catch myself staring at her sometimes, watching the way she moved, or the way she'd bite her lip when she was concentrating, and I'd have to physically shake myself out of it. Senior year, we moved into an apartment together off campus, just the two of us, and if our friends thought it was odd that we chose to live together instead of with a bigger group, they didn't say anything. That year was probably the happiest of my life up to that point. We had this comfortable routine, this domestic rhythm that felt so natural it scared me sometimes. She'd make coffee in the morning while I made breakfast. We'd sprawl on the couch together watching terrible reality TV. We'd fall asleep during movies with her head on my shoulder and wake up hours later, all tangled together. I dated a few guys that year. Nothing serious. And Rachel did too. But somehow none of those relationships ever seemed to stick. We'd always end up back on our couch, just the two of us. And I'd feel this sense of rightness that I never felt anywhere else. After graduation, we both got jobs in the same city. It felt inevitable. Like of course we'd stay together. Like the idea of being apart wasn't even worth considering. Rachel found an apartment first. A cute one-bedroom in a neighborhood we both loved. And when I went to look at places, everything felt wrong. Too far from her, too expensive, too small, too big, too something. Finally, one night over dinner, Rachel just looked at me and said, "Why don't you just move in with me? We can split the rent, it'll be cheaper for both of us, and we basically live together anyway." And I said yes before I even really thought about it because of course I did. Because the idea of waking up every morning with Rachel there felt like exactly what I wanted. So we got a 2-bedroom apartment, though honestly, we barely used both bedrooms. We'd start most nights in the living room, talking or watching something, and more often than not, one of us would fall asleep and the other would just stay there too, not wanting to break the spell of being close. My bedroom became more of a storage space for my clothes than anything else. I told myself this was just because we were best friends, because we were comfortable with each other, because this was just what close female friendships looked like. The night everything changed started like 100 other nights we'd had. It was a Friday. We were both tired from work, and we'd decided to stay in rather than go out with other friends. Rachel had picked up a bottle of wine on her way home. I'd ordered Thai food, and we were sprawled on the floor of our living room with takeout containers between us, talking about everything and nothing the way we always did. At some point, the conversation turned to dating, to our complete lack of successful relationships, to the fact that we were both intelligent, attractive women in our 20s who somehow couldn't seem to make things work with anyone. I remember Rachel laughing, this slightly bitter sound, and saying maybe we're just terrible at relationships. And I said, or maybe we just haven't found the right people yet. And she looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and said, maybe. There was something in her voice, something I'd never heard before, and I felt my heart start beating faster. We kept drinking, kept talking, and the conversation got more personal, more intimate. Rachel started talking about her last relationship, about how the guy had told her she was a terrible kisser, that she didn't know what she was doing, and I could see how much it had hurt her. I got angry on her behalf, told her he was clearly an idiot who didn't deserve her, and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said, maybe he was right though. Maybe I really don't know what I'm doing. And without thinking, without planning it, I said, I'm sure you're a great kisser. Rachel looked at me, really looked at me, and there was this long moment of silence where I felt like the air in the room had changed, had become thicker, harder to breathe. Then she said, how would you know? You've never kissed me. And I laughed, trying to break the tension, trying to make it a joke, but my laugh sounded wrong, too high, too forced. I said something like, well, no, obviously, but I'm sure you're good at it. She kept looking at me, and I couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell what she was thinking. Then she said, her voice quiet but steady, maybe you could teach me. Maybe you could show me what I'm doing wrong. And I stared at her, completely frozen, not sure if I'd heard her correctly, not sure if this was really happening. I managed to say, what? And she said, we're best friends, right? We tell each other everything. We help each other with everything. So why not this? You could teach me, tell me what feels good, what doesn't. It would just be practice, just us helping each other out. My mind was racing. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it, and I knew I should say no, knew this was crossing some kind of line, but instead, I heard myself say, okay, just like that, just okay. Like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I wasn't about to do something that would change everything. Rachel moved closer, and suddenly we were sitting face to face, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral that I'd always loved. She said, so how do we do this? And I realized I had no idea what I was doing, that I'd kissed plenty of people, but this felt completely different, felt terrifying and exciting and wrong and right all at once. I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, okay, so first, you want to make sure there's anticipation, you know? Don't just rush in. And she nodded, watching me intently, and I became hyper-aware of how close we were, of how I could feel her breath on my face. I said, you want to look at the person. Let them know what's about to happen. And I looked at her, really looked at her, let my eyes drop to her lips, and I saw her breath catch. Then, moving slowly, giving her time to pull away even though some part of me was praying she wouldn't, I leaned in. I told myself this was just teaching, just helping a friend. But the moment my lips touched hers, I knew I was lying to myself. I knew that this was what I'd wanted for years, what I'd been too scared to acknowledge, what I'd been pushing down and ignoring and pretending didn't exist. Her lips were soft, softer than I'd imagined. And yes, I'd imagined this even though I'd never let myself consciously acknowledge it. The kiss started gentle, almost chaste, just lips pressed together. But then something shifted. Rachel made this small sound, almost a whimper, and her hand came up to my face, her fingers tangling in my hair, and suddenly we were kissing for real. Not just teaching, not just practice, but kissing the way you kiss someone you want, someone you need. I remember thinking, very clearly, this is it. This is what I've been missing. This is what's been wrong with every other relationship I've ever had. Because nothing had ever felt like this. My whole body felt like it was on fire, every nerve ending alive in a way I'd never experienced. When her tongue touched my lip, asking for more, I opened for her without hesitation, and the kiss deepened, became hungry, desperate, years of repressed feelings pouring out in a single moment. We kissed until we were both breathless, until I didn't know where I ended, and she began, until the world outside that moment ceased to exist. When we finally pulled apart, we were both shaking, both staring at each other with wide eyes, both clearly thinking what the fuck just happened. Rachel's lipstick was smeared, her hair was messed up from my hands running through it, and she looked more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. There was this long moment of silence where neither of us knew what to say, where we just stared at each other trying to process what had just occurred. Finally, Rachel whispered, "That didn't feel like teaching." And I whispered back, "No, it didn't." And then she said, the words barely audible, "I think I've wanted to do that for years." And my heart stopped, actually stopped. And I heard myself say, "Me too." We sat there, still so close I could feel her breathing, and I felt like my entire world had just been turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my sexuality, about my feelings for Rachel, suddenly looked completely different. All those years of friendship, all those intense feelings I'd dismissed as just closeness, all those moments of jealousy and possessiveness and need that I'd told myself were normal, they all made sense now in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. Rachel said, "What does this mean?" And I said, "I don't know," because I didn't. I didn't know if I was gay or bi or something else entirely. I didn't know if this was just about Rachel or if this was about women in general. I didn't know anything except that kissing her had felt more right than anything else in my entire life, and I wanted to do it again, wanted to keep doing it, wanted to explore this thing between us that we'd both apparently been feeling for years. She said, "I'm scared." And I said, "Me too." And then I said, "But I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to go back to how things were and act like this doesn't change everything." And she looked at me with so much relief in her eyes and said, "I don't either." We talked for hours that night, barely moving from our spot on the floor. We talked about all the signs we'd both been ignoring, all the moments that had felt like more than friendship, but that we'd dismissed. Rachel told me about how she'd felt when she watched me date guys, how it had always hurt in a way she couldn't explain, how she'd tell herself she was just being protective, but deep down, knew it was something else. I told her about how I'd felt when she was with other people, about the jealousy I'd never wanted to name, about how I'd catch myself staring at her and have to force myself to look away. She said, "Do you think we've been in love this whole time?" And the question hung in the air between us, huge and terrifying and exhilarating. I said, "I think maybe we have been. We just didn't let ourselves see it." And she nodded, like that made perfect sense, like it explained everything about the past 4 years of our friendship. I remember asking her, "Are you attracted to other women? Or is it just me?" And she thought about it for a long moment and then said, "Honestly, I don't know. I've never really let myself think about it, but I know I'm attracted to you. I know that for certain now." And I realized I could say the same thing, that I'd spent so much energy not thinking about women in that way, that I didn't actually know what my sexuality was beyond knowing that I wanted Rachel. We kissed again that night, several more times, each kiss feeling like uncovering a truth that had been buried for too long. Each time felt less like practice and more like coming home, like finding the thing I'd been searching for without knowing I was searching. We didn't go further than kissing that night, both of us needing time to process, to understand what was happening between us. But it was enough. It was more than enough. The next morning, I woke up in her bed. We'd fallen asleep there after talking until dawn, and for a moment I panicked, wondering if it had all been some wine-fueled dream. But then Rachel stirred next to me, opened her eyes, and smiled at me with this soft, warm expression that made my heart race, and I knew it was real. She said, "Good morning," and I said, "Good morning." And there was this moment of awkwardness where neither of us knew exactly what to say, how to act, what came next. Rachel said, "So that really happened?" And I said, "Yeah, it really did." And she said, "Do you regret it?" And I said immediately, "No, God, no. Do you?" And she shook her head and said, "Not even a little bit." Then she said, "But I have no idea what we're supposed to do now." And I laughed because I didn't either, because we just completely upended our entire relationship and our understanding of ourselves, and there was no roadmap for this. We spent that whole weekend together, barely leaving the apartment, talking about everything. We talked about labels, about whether we needed to define what we were right away, or if we could just explore this thing between us and figure it out as we went. We talked about whether to tell our friends, our families, what it would mean to go from being best friends to something more. We talked about our fears, about what would happen if we tried this and it didn't work out, about whether we were risking the most important relationship in both our lives. But we also talked about the possibilities, about how amazing it felt to finally be honest about what we'd been feeling, about how right it seemed despite how scary it was. Rachel said at one point, "I feel like I've been walking around half asleep my whole life and I'm just now waking up." And I knew exactly what she meant, because I felt the same way, like everything suddenly had more color, more depth, more meaning. We kissed a lot that weekend, taking time to explore this new dimension of our relationship. Each kiss taught me something new about her, about myself, about what I wanted. I learned that she liked when I'd run my fingers through her hair, that she'd make this small noise in the back of her throat when I kissed her neck, that she was actually a very good kisser, despite what that idiot had told her, that touching her felt like the most natural thing in the world. By Sunday night, we'd made some decisions. We weren't going to label ourselves yet, weren't going to stress about whether we were gay or bi or whatever. We were just going to be us and figure it out as we went. We weren't going to make a big announcement to everyone, but we weren't going to hide either. We were going to take this slow, even though nothing about our relationship had ever been slow, and see where it went. And most importantly, we were going to protect our friendship above everything else, make sure that no matter what happened romantically, we didn't lose what we'd built over the past 4 years. Going back to work on Monday was surreal. I kept catching myself smiling for no reason, and my co-workers definitely noticed but didn't say anything. I texted Rachel probably 50 times that day, just random things, but really I just wanted to talk to her, to make sure this new thing between us was still real. She'd text back immediately every time, and I could almost hear her laughing at me through the phone. That first week was an adjustment. We had to learn how to be roommates and friends, and now something more all at once. There were awkward moments, like when we'd pass each other in the apartment and both pause, not sure if we were supposed to kiss now or not. There were moments of overthinking, of wondering if we were moving too fast, or not fast enough. But there were also beautiful moments, like when I'd be cooking dinner, and she'd come up behind me and wrap her arms around my waist and kiss my shoulder, like this was just something we did now, like we'd been doing it forever. Our friends started to notice something had shifted. We'd always been close, but now there was this new awareness between us, this electricity that I'm sure was obvious to anyone paying attention. My friend Sarah asked me one night if something was going on with Rachel and me, and I panicked and said no. We're just best friends like always. And she gave me this look that said she didn't believe me for a second, but she didn't push it. It took us about 3 weeks before we had the conversation about sex. We'd been taking things slow, spending a lot of time just kissing and touching and exploring, but there was this unspoken question hanging over us about what came next. I was nervous about it in a way I'd never been nervous with guys, because this mattered so much more, because I had no idea what I was doing, because I wanted it to be perfect for her. Rachel brought it up one night when we were lying on the couch together, my head on her chest, her fingers running through my hair. She said, "I think I want to take this further. I'm ready if you are." And my heart started racing, and I sat up to look at her and said, "I want that too. I've wanted that. I'm just nervous." And she smiled and said, "Me too. We can figure it out together." And I realized that's what we'd always done, figured things out together, and this would be no different. That night was both terrifying and incredible. There were awkward moments where we weren't sure what to do, where we had to laugh at ourselves and communicate and adjust. But there were also these perfect moments where everything just clicked, where touching her felt like the most natural thing in the world, where I discovered what made her gasp, what made her moan, what made her pull me closer. I learned that intimacy with someone you truly care about, someone you trust completely, is completely different than anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual almost, this deep connection that went beyond bodies and touch. Afterwards, we lay tangled together, both of us a little stunned by what had just happened, by how right it had felt. Rachel said, "I don't think I can go back to guys after this." And I laughed and said, "Me neither." And we both realized in that moment that this wasn't just about us, wasn't just about our specific relationship, but about understanding something fundamental about ourselves that we'd been ignoring. Over the next few months, I went through what I can only describe as a second adolescence. I was figuring out my sexuality at 23, in ways I should have been doing at 13. I spent hours online reading about different sexual orientations, trying to understand where I fit, what label made sense for me. Rachel and I talked about it constantly, comparing notes, sharing articles we'd read, discussing how our feelings for each other related to our feelings about women in general. I remember the first time I saw another woman and felt attraction, really let myself feel it instead of pushing it away. Rachel and I were at a coffee shop, and this gorgeous woman walked in, and I found myself staring, taking her in, feeling that flutter of attraction. I'd always told myself before that I was just admiring women aesthetically, appreciating their beauty the way you'd appreciate a piece of art. But this felt different. This felt like the way I'd looked at guys I was attracted to, except somehow more intense. I turned to Rachel and whispered, "I think I'm attracted to her." And Rachel looked at the woman, then back at me, and grinned and said, "Okay, yeah, I can see that. She's gorgeous." And there was no jealousy in her voice, just this sense of shared understanding, of figuring this out together. We talked about it on the walk home, about how we were both discovering that our attraction to each other wasn't an isolated thing, but part of a broader truth about ourselves. Coming out was a gradual process. We told our closest friends first, separately at first, and then together. Most of them weren't surprised at all. Several said they'd been wondering when we'd figure it out. My friend Sarah laughed and said, "You two have been in love for years. We were all just waiting for you to realize it." My parents were harder. I called them a few months into my relationship with Rachel, and my mom cried, not because she was upset, but because she didn't understand, kept asking if I was sure, if maybe this was just a phase. I tried to explain to her that yes, I was sure, that this wasn't about rebellion or confusion, but about finally understanding myself, about finding the right person regardless of gender. My dad was quieter, just said that he wanted me to be happy, and that if Rachel made me happy, that was what mattered. It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was a start, and I knew they'd need time to adjust the same way I'd needed time. Rachel's family was different. Her mom just said, "I always knew, honey. I've been waiting for you to tell me." Apparently, Rachel's sexuality had been obvious to her mother in ways it hadn't been obvious to Rachel herself. Her dad struggled more, but came around quickly when he saw how happy we were together. At Thanksgiving that year, both our families were there, and watching them interact, watching them accept us as a couple, felt like this huge milestone. I'd be lying if I said everything was easy. We had to navigate a world that wasn't always welcoming to queer couples, deal with stares and comments and the occasional outright hostility. We had to learn how to be out in public, whether to hold hands or not, whether to correct people who assumed we were just friends. We had to deal with the fact that some of our friends and family members struggled with acceptance, that some people we'd thought would be supportive turned out not to be. But we also discovered this whole new community, found queer friends who understood our experience, went to pride events and felt the power of being surrounded by people like us. I started identifying as bisexual. Rachel identified as lesbian. And we both felt this sense of freedom in finally having words for what we were. We joked sometimes about how we'd done everything backwards, fallen in love before coming out. But in a way, I think it made sense for us. We'd needed each other to feel safe enough to explore this part of ourselves. Looking back now, 5 years later, I can see how that night changed everything. That kiss wasn't just the beginning of a romantic relationship with Rachel, though it was definitely that. It was the beginning of me understanding myself, accepting myself, living authentically in a way I never had before. It was the moment I stopped pretending, stopped performing the version of myself I thought I was supposed to be, and started actually living. Rachel and I are still together, still best friends and lovers and partners in every sense. We got married last year in a small ceremony with our closest friends and family, and I cried through the whole thing because I kept thinking about that girl who sat on the floor of an apartment 5 years ago, terrified and exhilarated, kissing her best friend, and discovering a truth she'd been hiding from herself for years. I wished I could go back and tell her that everything would work out, that the scary leap she was about to take would lead to the happiest years of her life. I think about all the signs I missed, all the moments I explained away, all the feelings I dismissed as just friendship. I think about how many years I spent not knowing myself, not understanding this fundamental truth about who I am. And I wonder how many other women are out there, in intense friendships with other women, feeling things they're afraid to name, explaining away attractions as admiration, not letting themselves see what's right in front of them. If I could tell those women anything, it would be this. It's okay to question. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to not have all the answers. Sexuality isn't always something you just know from birth. Sometimes it's something you discover, something you grow into, something that surprises you when you're least expecting it. And falling in love with your best friend, discovering that the most important person in your life could be even more than you imagined, is one of the most beautiful things that can happen. That night when Rachel taught me how to kiss, or rather, when I taught her, and we both discovered something profound about ourselves in the process, was the night my real life started. Everything before was just preparation, just getting me ready for the moment when I'd be brave enough to be honest, to feel what I was feeling without fear, to reach for what I wanted, instead of what I thought I should want. I still remember every detail of that kiss. The way her lips felt against mine. The way my whole body came alive in a way it never had before. The way the world seemed to shift and realign around this new truth. I remember the terror and the exhilaration, the feeling of jumping off a cliff and discovering you can fly. I remember thinking, very clearly, that everything was about to change, and I was right. Everything did change, in the best possible way. Now, when I look at Rachel, my wife, my best friend, my partner in everything, I feel grateful for that night, for the wine and the vulnerability and the courage it took for both of us to step into the unknown. I'm grateful for every moment since then, every kiss, every conversation, every discovery about myself and about us. I'm grateful for this life we've built, this authentic, honest, beautiful life, where I get to be fully myself, where I get to love openly and completely without hiding or pretending. My lesbian era didn't start when my best friend taught me how to kiss. It started when I taught her, when we taught each other, when we both stopped lying to ourselves and each other and admitted what we'd been feeling all along. It started when I chose honesty over comfort, when I chose love over fear, when I chose to see the truth even though it meant rethinking everything I thought I knew about myself. And it's the best thing that ever happened to me.